I went over as part of Reconstruction Task Force, the second Reconstruction Task Force in 2007. Arrived in May, so it was the start of the dry season, the fighting season. The snow was melting off the mountains. It was quite surreal to come into a region such as Uruzgan into Tarankout. Our main role was to carry out reconstruction works in the Uruzgan province, in Tarankout province, and go out, communicate with the locals, go out with the villages and negotiate, communicate what works they needed to be done, and then progressed in the project management of those works outside the wire into schools, hospitals, roads, all the infrastructure works, bridge crossings in Tarankout that needed to be done for the locals to get on with their lives. The main way we ensured that the projects were worthwhile was negotiating and communicating with the communities to find out exactly what they actually needed, as opposed to imposing works on the communities that didn't really or weren't really required. In the past, or in some instances, we had some community leaders come and tell us that they wanted a well in a certain location, and then we'd proceed with the contractor to install that well and get another community leader arriving at Camp Holland saying that well's in the wrong location, he doesn't own that land. So you did have conflict in different communities of who owned what land, who owned what titles, and who clearly wanted what for either the benefit of the community or the benefit of the individual person. We did do a lot of construction works or quick backyard blitz works outside the wire, but it took a lot of planning, a lot of security effort to get outside and do works in a real security issue area. At times, a lot of the works had to be prefabricated and rehearsals done inside the compound before we went out to shorten the period of time outside the wire and on the ground. You had to plan in with a lot of detail and go through different scenarios. If something fails, then you have to have a backup plan or alternative plans all the time. Otherwise, it's a lot of lives at risk if your plan doesn't come together or the work doesn't get done or the mission doesn't get achieved. It wasn't like just going down to the local BBC or the Bunnings and grabbing some materials and then focusing on doing the job. You had to plan and plan in detail. If you went outside the wire and forgot something or something didn't work, it had a lot of repercussions. We employed local contractors, local construction contractors to do a fair bit of the construction works, and that allowed us to get out and inspect and manage the works periodically on site. The interpreters had to be highly qualified in interpreting the right information, and we had to be aware of what was clearly interpreted to and from the contractors to make sure that they'd follow through. You only have one opportunity to get the information correct across to the managers of the construction works. So you needed to take that opportunity to make sure that the information was very clear and direct on what you wanted to achieve, by when and to what standard. There was mistakes made along the way. There was things done incorrectly. We'd find things built incorrectly, as simple as using the wrong stone for the concrete that was provided, whether it's pebble rock or blue metal. It can greatly affect the engineering and integrity of the building. Some of their concepts and ideas were quite abstract to us, especially when we went to a school, provided water tank and guttering on a building and taps just so the kids could wash their hands at school when they went to the toilet. We went back a week or 2 weeks later, the guttering had been pulled down, the taps have been pulled out, and they explained to us that water doesn't come from the sky, it comes from the ground, from wells and bores located throughout the province. So their concept of water coming from the sky was that it was contaminated, and water coming from the ground was the water that you drink. There was many times where we went out to review works or look at the progress of works. Sometimes we went back to schools and hospitals where some of the works that we'd previously done had been damaged, pulled down, ripped apart, or didn't last for a long period of time. There was times where we'd build something and then there'd be theft overnight, where we'd build a swing set for a school or a water tank for a school, and then go back a couple of weeks later to inspect works and see that some of the things have been stolen or just damaged and removed. The initial concept of the Tulani School was to provide security around the compound, as in provide a significant wall around the outside of the compound and provide security for the teachers and also the students within, and then progress in repairing the toilet block out the back and repairing the roof and the infrastructure for the school. At the same time we were doing those construction, or the contractors were doing the construction works, we were also getting our engineers back at Camp Holland to build desks, build tables and furniture for the students in the school. To go outside the wire, at times it was a release for some soldiers to get out and appreciate the country. Where those that were stuck inside the confines of the base, it was hard for them to appreciate what was outside and not getting out and about. We had to be aware of security all the time, obviously, but there was times where we'd have the unmanned aerial surveillance come over and tell us or provide information through the chain of command, telling us that there was a situation that was arising and that you needed to vacate certain areas. And that became quite unnerving at different times. A lot of times we went into communities mounted and then dismount to walk in through communities. Clearances had to be done in the villages before we progressed and moved in to inspect works. So the security concerns were quite high when we were unsure of the security situation. The IED threat obviously is one of the largest threats to our guys and our forces. We try and focus on doing our job to the best of our ability, but to manoeuvre through the countryside in the vehicles and get to and from, we had to do a lot of clearances to reduce that IED threat, rely on intelligence wherever we went. But many times we came to a crossing where we thought there was a choke point or a threat. We had to use the engineers to clear the choke point. That could take quite a considerable amount of time to do a thorough job. It could take anywhere from 3 hours to 4 hours waiting to get a crossing cleared to progress on to a project or a construction site or a task we had to achieve. When we had loss of life, the focus was obviously on the ramp ceremony and getting that member home. To focus on the work itself and making sure that we were there to do a job and that we were there for a reason and that it wasn't a sacrifice in losing soldiers for no reason at all. There's many little things that stay in one's mind when you go to such a place as Afghanistan. One thing that did stick in my mind quite vividly was working at the hospital at the time and watching a young boy come into the hospital. He would have been roughly the age of 7 or 8, came in with a broken arm, broken fingers, bruised jaw, broken jaw. And I talked to the interpreter who we always have close by and asked him what was the situation, because you see people coming and going from the hospital all times of the day. And he explained to me that he'd lost his mother, his father in an explosion or indirect fire attack, and then he'd been palmed over to extended family to be looked after. Obviously, he didn't receive the same care from the extended family. And here he is by himself trying to get medical support from a facility with no adult or support from any extended family. And coming in, and you could see the look on his face. This boy's trying to get the absolute basics of what we take for granted. It can be quite hard to explain to extended members of family that are not military, asking the questions, why would you ever want to go back to such a place when you've already been there before, you're aware of the dangers and you're aware of what you're going into. But we're trained to do a professional job, and the one place that you would, after all the training that you've gone through in your career, get the opportunity to deploy into a location. For some family members, it's quite hard to understand. The second time I went back, you saw that the base had obviously increased in massive size with infrastructure, with the soldiers, with the equipment. Yeah, the initial time that I went over in 2007, doing security pickets at night from the towers, you would look over Tarankout and there'd be a lot of darkness throughout the whole community. The only people that have lighting or lights in their koalas or compound facilities were those that could afford generators and fuel to keep those generators running. Going back over in 2010, there was a vast difference in the sheer amount of lighting and power. Obviously, people had more infrastructure, more dollars and more equipment to be able to light up the community of a night time. The township of Tarankout obviously expanded at a great rate. With the turnover of all the work and the financial support that was provided by the coalition. The community was a hub of activity. The living conditions in Tarankout or in Camp Holland was quite unique. We initially, when I went over there in 2007, we were living in small tin shacks with a corrugated roof, and the idea was to get all defence members into hardened, protected accommodation. So progressively we manoeuvred into hardened accommodation, the Draytainer accommodation, which was armoured or up-armoured, specifically designed 20-foot containers where you are living in generally four to a container, or a 20-foot container, and it can be quite claustrophobic in itself and stuck in that tight facility and stuck with three other guys that might all snore at night time. Definitely do come back with a sense of completion and a sense of achieving a great deal, that you've left an ongoing legacy behind with some of these countries. You have a lot of guys that deploy and go overseas, provide security, provide logistics, but don't really see a lot of benefits or ongoing benefits for long term, where on the engineering and construction side of infrastructure, something that we build and is managed by us, planned by us, designed by us, and provided specifically for the community, you have a sense of completion and an ongoing effect when you do leave. Personally, I think it's been definitely worth it to give the average Afghani people and the communities a sense of achievement in having their own infrastructure, their own schools, their own hospitals, their own road systems, their own crossing points, giving them a bit of a step up where things have been really demolished and ripped apart. It gives them a sense of confidence.